James Brown had a poverty problem. When he showed up at school, kids would laugh at his clothes. When he walked into stores, people would stare at his bare feet. The poverty made him quiet, ashamed, almost invisible. But in 1943, at age 10, James walked into the Lenox Theatre in Augusta, Georgia, and demanded to be in the talent show. The manager looked at this barefoot kid in rags and said no. James didn't leave. He stood there until the manager got tired of looking at him. "Fine," the manager finally said. "You got 5 minutes." James stepped onto that stage barefoot, terrified, poor. But then something miraculous happened. When James started performing, the poverty vanished. Completely, his shame disappeared. And for the first time, James realized when he performed, he wasn't broken anymore. Augusta, Georgia, summer of 1943. World War II was raging overseas, but in Augusta's black neighborhoods, there was a different kind of war happening. The war against poverty, hunger, and invisibility. James Brown was 10 years old. He lived in a shack on the outskirts of Augusta, a place so run down that calling it a house was generous. No electricity, no running water, holes in the roof. When it rained, James and his aunt would put buckets around the room to catch the water. When it was cold, they huddled together for warmth because they couldn't afford heat. James's mother had left when he was 4. His father worked in a turpentine camp and rarely came home. James lived with his Aunt Honey, who did her best, but there was only so much she could do. They were poor. Not poor like we can't afford nice things. Poor like we don't know if we'll eat today. James didn't have shoes. He'd had a pair once, but he'd outgrown them 2 years ago, and there was no money for new ones. So James walked everywhere barefoot, to school, to the store, to church. His feet were tough and calloused, but that didn't stop people from staring. That didn't stop kids from pointing and laughing. At school, James sat in the back and tried to be invisible. His clothes were too small, patched in places, worn in others. Sometimes he wore the same shirt for a week, because it was the only one he had. The other kids called him dirty and poor boy. The teachers felt sorry for him but didn't know what to do. So James learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to disappear. But there was one thing James couldn't hide from Mainz music. In Augusta's black community, music was everywhere. Church on Sundays where people sang gospel so powerful it made the walls shake. Street corners where men played blues guitar for pennies. Jukeboxes in the corner. Stores playing the latest records. Music was in the air. James breathed, and James loved it. All of it. When nobody was around, James would sing to himself. He'd dance. He'd move his body to rhythms only he could hear. Music was the only time James felt free. The only time he forgot he was poor. The only time he felt like he mattered. In the summer of 1943, word spread through Augusta's black community that the Lenox Theatre was having a talent show. The Lenox was the colored theatre, the only place black folks could see movies and shows. And once a month, they held an amateur talent night where local people could perform. Winners got $5. $5 was a fortune to a kid like James. $5 could buy food for a week. But more than the money, James wanted something else. He wanted to stand on a stage. He wanted people to see him, not as the poor barefoot kid, not as the invisible boy in the back of class, but as someone who mattered, someone who could do something special. James told his Aunt Honey he wanted to enter the talent show. She looked at him with sad eyes. "Baby, you don't have nothing to wear. I'll wear what I got. You don't have shoes. I'll go barefoot. I always do." Honey wanted to say no. She wanted to protect James from the humiliation she knew was coming, but when she looked at his face, at the hope in his eyes, she couldn't crush it. "Okay, baby. If you want to try, you try." The night of the talent show, the Lenox Theatre was packed. People came from all over Black Augusta to see the show. There were singers, dancers, comedians, all kinds of acts. Most of them were adults or teenagers. Very few kids performed. James arrived at the theatre wearing the only clothes he had, Maya's pants too short for his growing legs, a shirt with holes in it, and no shoes. He walked up to the stage door where a white manager was checking in performers. "I'm here for the talent show," James said, his voice small. The manager looked down at James. He saw the bare feet, the ragged clothes, the dirt on James's face from walking through Augusta's dusty streets. "Boy, this ain't for you. Go on home." "I can perform," James said. "You got an act?" "I can sing. I can dance." The manager laughed, not meanly, but dismissively. "Boy, look at you. You can't go on stage looking like that. People paid money to see this show. Now go on." James didn't move. "Please, sir, I can do it. I just need 5 minutes." "I said no. Now get out of here before I have somebody move you." James stood there. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just stood there, looking at the manager with eyes that said, "I'm not leaving." The manager went back to checking in other performers. James stayed. 10 minutes passed. 20. The manager kept glancing at James, expecting him to give up and leave. But James didn't move. Finally, the manager got tired of seeing this barefoot kid standing there. "Jesus Christ. Fine. You got 5 minutes. You mess up, I'm pulling you off that stage myself. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" "James Brown." "James Brown. Okay. You're going on last. Don't make me regret this." James waited backstage for 2 hours. He watched all the other acts go on. Singers with nice clothes, dancers with shiny shoes, adults who knew what they were doing. James was terrified. What was he thinking? He was a 10-year-old kid with no shoes and no training. He was going to humiliate himself in front of hundreds of people. His feet were cold on the concrete backstage floor. His stomach was churning. Several times he thought about running, just leaving. Nobody would miss him. Nobody would care. But then he heard the announcer. "And our last act tonight, a young man from right here in Augusta, James Brown." There was polite applause. Not excited, just polite. James walked onto that stage, and the first thing he noticed was how bright the lights were. He couldn't see the audience, but he could feel them. Hundreds of people out there in the dark. And here he was, barefoot, in rags, alone on a stage. The music started. Near blues number the band knew. James was supposed to sing. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The shame hit him hard. All those people could see him, see how poor he was, see his bare feet, see his ragged clothes. But then something happened. The music wrapped around James like a blanket. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he wasn't on a stage in the Lenox Theatre. He was somewhere else. Somewhere the poverty didn't matter. Somewhere he wasn't invisible. James started moving, not thinking about it, just moving. His body responded to the music in ways his mind couldn't explain. He started singing, not a perfect voice, but a voice filled with something real, something honest. Something that came from living 10 years in poverty and finding the one thing that made you feel alive. James danced. He spun. He moved across that stage like he'd been born on it. The audience, who'd been politely bored, suddenly woke up. Who was this kid? Where did this come from? James forgot he was barefoot. He forgot his clothes were rags. He forgot every kid who'd ever laughed at him, Every teacher who'd pitied him, every person who'd looked at him like he was nothing. On that stage, James Brown was not nothing. He was everything. When the music stopped, James opened his eyes. The theater was silent for a moment. That moment before applause when everyone's too shocked to react. Then the place exploded. People were on their feet, cheering, screaming, whistling. James stood there, breathing hard, not quite believing what had just happened. The judges deliberated for less than a minute. When the announcer came back on stage, he had a huge smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner. That barefoot kid who just tore up this stage. James Brown." The place went crazy again. James was handed $5, more money than he'd ever held in his life. People were slapping his back, shaking his hand, telling him he was amazing, but James barely heard them, because James had discovered something that night, something more valuable than $5. He'd discovered the one place in the world where being poor didn't matter, where having no shoes didn't matter, where all the shame and invisibility disappeared. He'd discovered the stage. After the show, James walked home through the dark Augusta streets, $5 in his pocket, his feet still bare on the dusty road. But he wasn't thinking about his feet. He was thinking about how it felt to stand under those lights, how it felt when the music started and everything else disappeared, how it felt to make hundreds of people pay attention to him, not because they pitied him, but because they couldn't look away. His Aunt Honey was waiting up when he got home. She saw the light in his eyes before she saw the money in his hand. "You won," she said. It wasn't a question. "I won." Honey hugged him tight. "I knew you would, baby. I knew you would." That night, James lay on his thin mattress in that shack with holes in the roof, listening to the sounds of Augusta at night. And he made himself a promise. He was going to get back on that stage, and then another stage, and another. He was going to perform until everyone in the world knew his name. Not as the poor barefoot kid, but as James Brown, the performer, the showman, the man who owned every stage he stood on. Years later, when James Brown was the biggest star in music, when he'd performed for presidents and kings, when he'd sold millions of records and filled the biggest arenas in the world, people would ask him about his confidence. Where did it come from? How did he become so fearless? And James would always go back to that night in 1943, the Lenox Theatre. Age 10, barefoot, terrified, poor. That was the night I learned something, James would say. When you're barefoot and poor, and people look at you like you're nothing, you got two choices. You can believe them and disappear, or you can find the one thing that makes you feel alive and hold on to it like your life depends on it, because it does. And performing was that thing. Performing saved my life. On that stage, I wasn't the poor kid anymore. I wasn't invisible. I was somebody. And once I felt that, once I knew what it was like to matter, I never let go. I couldn't let go. That stage was the only place I was free. The manager who'd tried to turn James away that night saw him perform many times over the years as James became famous. Decades later, someone asked the manager if he remembered that night at the Lenox. "Remember it," the manager said. "I'll never forget it. I looked at that barefoot kid and saw nothing. Then he got on stage and became everything. That's when I learned you can't judge talent by what somebody's wearing or what they don't have. You judge it by what happens when the music starts." And when the music started for James Brown, magic happened. The Lenox Theatre is gone now, torn down decades ago, but in Augusta's black community, older folks still tell the story about the night a 10-year-old barefoot kid stepped onto that stage and discovered he was born to perform. The night poverty disappeared and a legend was born. If this story of transformation, courage, and finding where you belong moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that your circumstances don't define you. Your courage does. Where do you feel most alive? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when legends discovered who they were meant to be.